Greetings. My name is Stephen Butler Murray. I am the Executive Director of the Congregational Library and Archives in Boston, Massachusetts, and we are excited to begin a series of online conversations with prominent historians about their work, important events in American religious history, and the very vocation of becoming a historian. I am joined today by Dr. Frank Bremer, coordinator of New England Beginnings, editor of the Winthrop Papers, and Professor Emeritus of History at Millersville University in Pennsylvania. He's also a member of the board of the Congregational Library and Archives and the chair of our program committee. And as we approach Thanksgiving, I could think of no one better prepared to offer some thoughts on the history and meaning of the first Thanksgiving. Dr. Bremer, it's a delight to welcome you to this conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here in this particularly modern way of communicating.
So Dr. Bremer, was the Pilgrim Feast in the fall of 1621 the first Thanksgiving, as is often stated?
No, is the simple answer. As many are quick to point out, earlier occasions of Thanksgiving occurred in places like Florida, Texas, Virginia, and elsewhere in early America. And it's not surprising that colonists everywhere in the New World observed days of Thanksgiving. They were all part of a general European culture in which most men and women believed that there were no hard and fast division between their earthly experience and the spiritual cosmos. They were convinced that their experiences every day were at least in part shaped by supernatural interventions. In their everyday lives, they might be touched by the divine or potentially by the devil. If they suffered misfortune individually or as a society, it was likely that they were being punished by God directly or by his allowing the devil to work against them for their failures to live godly lives. If they experienced good fortune, they attributed it to God rewarding them. Now, for centuries, it had been common for Christians to do penance for their sins and to beg God's forgiveness. Prior to the settlement of New England, Puritans in England would have joined in prayers to relieve the sufferings of the plague, as well as prayers of thanks offered to God on occasions such as the defeat of the Spanish Armada. The 1571 Book of Homilies, issued by the Church of England, actually recommended the observance of days of fast and prayer when appropriate. So, in terms of our interest today, interest in the Pilgrims, fasting and raising prayers to seek God's blessing and prayers of thanks when those petitions had been answered became a particularly important aspect of how Puritans in particular related to their world. And accustomed to the practice in England, they brought it with them to New England.
That's fascinating. Now, putting aside what was done in other colonies, how does the fall 1621 event fit in the history of New England?
Good question. I like to answer this by pointing out that probably the first American Thanksgiving of the Pilgrims occurred not in the fall of 1621, but in November of 1620. The 102 colonists who had crowded onto the Mayflower had just endured a physically and emotionally challenging voyage of 66 days. Adding to their concern was their knowledge of the disastrous voyage of a different separatist group, led by the Reverend Francis Blackwell, setting forth for Virginia in 1618, packed together as herrings, as one account put it. That separatist group had experienced the flux, what we know as dysentery, and also want of fresh water, with the result that 130 of them, the vast majority of the passengers, died before reaching America. So the Pilgrims knew the dangers when they set forth from Europe, and on their own voyage, the Mayflower passengers experienced crosswinds. They met with fierce storms. The The colonist William Bradford remembered that during some of those storms, the winds were so fierce and the seas so high as they could not proceed further towards their destination, the sails being lowered and the ship pushed back some ways towards England. During a particularly bad storm, one of the main beams midships cracked, and the ship could have broken up and sunk, but a house jack that the Pilgrims had brought with them was able to push the beam back into place and secure it. Well, finally, after 66 days crossing the vast and furious ocean, as Bradford called it, the colonists disembarked and, in his words, fell upon their knees and blessed the God of heaven who had brought them over the vast and furious ocean and delivered them from all the perils and miseries thereof. We can imagine them falling down, kissing the ground and saying, "Thank God we made it." And that, in a sense, was their first American Thanksgiving. Well, it wouldn't be their last. Indeed, little more than a month later, on December 20th, 1620, having settled upon the site of the former native village Patuxet to be their new home, one of the colonists recorded in his personal Bible that we meet for prayer and thanksgiving. So this practice of getting together to thank God for the blessings he had given them, the deliverance they had benefited from, was common. Over the course of the 17th century, there would be literally hundreds of fast and Thanksgiving days in New England, some set by towns or individual congregations, many set by colonial authorities. A good example to give us an idea of the flavor of this is an observation recorded by John Lothrop, the minister of the town of Scituate, in December 1636. On a very cold day, the record tells us, the congregation gathered in their meeting house around 8:30 in the morning. They joined in a short prayer, sang a psalm, listened to a longer prayer, followed by another psalm. They then listened to the Reverend Lothrop preach, and after a closing prayer and psalm, they dispersed around noon for making merry, the record tells us, the poorer sort being invited to the richer for a Thanksgiving Day meal. So that's how this often occurred. Now, what does this tell us about the fall 1621, so-called first Thanksgiving? We don't actually have as good an account of that event as we do of the Scituate event. Governor William Bradford, the colony governor, simply recorded that there was a successful harvest accompanied by the catching of cod, bass, and other fish, and the hunting of waterfowl, wild turkeys, and yes, they did have turkey, and deer. One of the other colonists, Edward Winslow, offered a more substantial account. After the success of the harvest, he wrote, the governor sent out hunters so that we might, after a special manner, rejoice together after we had gathered the fruit of our labors. The hunters killed as much fowl, with a little help beside, as served the company for almost a week. It is Winslow who also tells us of the arrival of Wampanoag visitors, who outnumbered the colonists 2-1, and who themselves supplied venison for the feast. Indeed, it's the presence of these natives at the feast, this gesture of harmony, that is one of the things that does distinguish this Thanksgiving, the 1621 Thanksgiving, from others elsewhere in America and also in New England. And it's interesting that the welcoming of the strangers, the others, was something that was very well in accord with how the Puritans and the Pilgrims understood the scriptures. But was this a Thanksgiving? Some people want to argue it was simply a harvest festival and so forth. But everything we know about these pilgrims and their beliefs make it reasonable to believe that before the feasting began, there was a session of prayer, preaching, and singing psalms. It was part of who they were. And while neither of the men who recorded the event called it by the name of a Thanksgiving, Winslow's account incorporated biblical phrases from John 4:36, and he that soweth and he that reapeth might rejoice together. And also Psalm 33, where the righteous are called to bless God for the gifts that he gave them. And we have additional, again, indirect evidence from just a few years later. Faced with a severe drought in May of 1623, Governor Bradford appointed what he called a special day of humiliation to seek the Lord by humble and fervent prayer. And when that seeking of the Lord was followed by seasonable showers and a fruitful and liberal harvest, they set aside what Bradford called a day of thanksgiving. So that's what I think we can take from the accounts that we have of what happened in the fall of 1621.
What did a day of Thanksgiving mean to them?
Well, first of all, it meant an acknowledgement that while men and women were supposed to strive to do the best they could with the talents that God had given them, their ultimate success still depended upon God's blessing. And so God was responsible in part for the good things that happened to them. And it was an act of faith and piety to give thanks to God. Now, that being said, there are misconceptions. And one of the misconceptions is that a lot of people conflate the 1621 feast with a 1636 Thanksgiving, arguing that what the Pilgrims gathered for in the fall of 1621 was to celebrate the murder of Native Americans. Well, on the surface, of course, since there were Native Americans at the feast and joining in the activities and festivities, that's something of a stretch. What's happened is that people looking to condemn the Pilgrims and the Puritans for their lifestyle conflate the 1621 event with an event in 1636, when in the fall of 1636, the Massachusetts General Court called for a day of Thanksgiving for a number of reasons. It was to thank God because the controversy that had swirled around Anne Hutchinson and threatened the future of the colony was finally over. They had had a good harvest and they were thanking God for that. The Protestant forces in the 30 Years' War in Germany were successful at the time, and that was something they were very happy about. And finally, the colonies, Massachusetts particularly, had achieved victory in a war with one of the local tribes in the region, the Pequots. That was a victory won with the aid of Native allies. So there were a lot of reasons why they wanted to give thanks. Now, the fact is, the victory over the Pequots was achieved by tactics that we would find deplorable, but were common at the time. Members of the Pequot fort, the Pequots were surrounded in a fort, and rather than go in and engage in what essentially would be door-to-door fighting against a superior force, the colonists set fire to the village and killed many of those coming out, which included non-combatants. Again, this was common warfare at the time. It's something that we would deplore, but it is one of the many things that were being given thanks for in 1636. And to say that that was the reason and then conflate it with 1621 is an error. It's an error which every year we see in newspaper accounts about the Pilgrims. Had nothing to do with what happened in 1621.
So in what way is the Pilgrim Thanksgiving different from the holiday that we celebrate?
Well, the most common difference, or the most significant difference, I should say, is that we set an annual day of Thanksgiving, which represents, if I may borrow from another religious tradition, having been brought up in New York City, a certain amount of chutzpah, that we can count upon the fact that on the third Thursday of every November, we're going to have lots of things to be thankful for. The Pilgrims and the Puritans would never have assumed that. They never had an annual day of Thanksgiving. They felt that the gifts of God were to be earned, not just counted on as automatic. And so they spent a lot of time looking at the particular blessings they had received and setting aside a day to honor those specific blessings. And that's the major difference from what happens today.
Well, that's fantastic. Dr. Bremer, what a pleasure to learn more about the first Thanksgiving. Thank you so much for your time today, and we'll have to do this again soon.